My next guest, Henry Kissinger, has been a controversial figure since his days as National Security Advisor, then Secretary of State under Richard Nixon. At 99, he is still stirring up controversy with his recent comments about how to end the war in Ukraine. He's the author of the new book, Leadership: 6 Studies in World Strategy. It's a terrific book, well worth reading. Henry Kissinger, pleasure to have you on.
Glad to be here.
So the book is terrific. I've read it and really, really enjoyed it, and I couldn't recommend it more to people. But I'm going to start by talking about a leader who's not profiled in this book. How many times have you met Vladimir Putin?
Maybe 15.
And these are long, almost always one-on-one meetings?
Yes, always one-on-one. And I met Putin for the first time when he was deputy mayor of St. Petersburg. And I had no idea who he was. And he was talking about the then occurring collapse of the Russian Empire, of the Soviet Empire. And he said, this is one of the great tragedies of history, because it will create endless trouble and new definitions of borders and of influence. But it was just, at that time, an interesting conversation.
So when you think about Putin as a leader, if you were to analyze him in the way that you have analyzed the leaders in this book, what is the thing that strikes you most strongly about Putin?
His passionate, almost mystical view of the nature of Russia. He is very intelligent, very analytical, quite aloof. But on one occasion he said to me, some days I think I know everything, and other days I think I know nothing. That it's not something world leaders would usually say in conversations, but it indicates the inner struggle he was going through in dealing with both the domestic evolution and his perception of the foreign challenges to Russia.
When you say, he's very analytic, that's also been my experience in the few times I've met him. So what explains what seems, he also seems careful. What explains this very bold, almost reckless move in Ukraine?
I wouldn't have expected it. I thought when he concentrated the troops around Ukraine, it was for bargaining. And I wouldn't have been surprised if he had taken a slice. But to attack the whole country and try to reincorporate it, you can interpret it in one of two ways. The way it is generally interpreted, I know almost no exception, it's that he wanted to reconstruct the empire. But you could also interpret it as a recognition of growing Russian relative weakness, that the domestic situation is not evolving very rapidly. And here the West is approaching via Ukraine. And I think that I interpreted it to myself as much as a last act to show that there were limits to what Russia could tolerate.
So you proposed at Davos that Ukraine make clear that it does not intend to go further than the February 24th lines. In other words, that it wanted to reverse Russia's aggression this year, but not go further. And that became somewhat controversial.
I didn't even address it to the Ukraine.
Right.
I said a dividing line for ending the war should be the status quo ante.
Right. a return to
to
February 24th situation.
Yeah, but that's still a very substantial retreat
for the Russians.
For the Russians.
But you're saying, I want to be clear, you're saying you do not believe that it will be easy to get the Russians back to those lines. In other words, reversing the aggression of this year.
Will be very difficult. But I think it has to be our objective. Because if we settle for whatever the situation is when the Russians offer a negotiation, and if it acquires thereby all of the Donbass and the stretch along the Black Sea, that will be interpreted that in the end, NATO could not protect a friendly country.
The problem of Ukraine fundamentally is, it seems to me, that the Ukrainians sort of reject entirely this, what you call the mystical Russian narrative, right? They see themselves as firmly part of the West. They want to be a liberal democracy. They want to be, capitalist society. They want to be allied with the West. Can Putin live with that?
Well, before the war, I would have said no. And I warned against incorporating Ukraine into NATO 10 years ago and predicted it would lead to some sort of conflict. But the solution that I had then, or that I had in mind, to make Ukraine a bridge between Europe and Russia, it's not possible now after the destruction of this war and the way it's been conducted and the suddenness of the attack. So now Ukraine, whether formally or not, is part of Europe. And that will be a very hard decision for Putin to make. And it may not be Putin who makes that decision, or it may not be Putin who survives that decision.
Next on GPS, I will ask Henry Kissinger whether January 6th was a bigger deal than Watergate. And we are back here on GPS with more of my interview with Henry Kissinger, the author of the new book, Leadership: 6 Studies in World Strategy. Let me ask you finally about one leader you write about, Richard Nixon.
Yes.
So when I talked to David Gergen recently, we were talking about leadership, and I asked him about Nixon. And he said, the lesson I draw from Richard Nixon's experience was he's one of the smartest people ever to have occupied the White House, but he had internal demons. And unless you have dealt with your internal demons, they will in some way come out. Do you agree with that?
The Nixon I encountered had a capacity for making extremely courageous decisions and was a great patriot about the purposes of America. But he also was driven by a sense of insecurity in which he found it very difficult to give orders to somebody he knew disagreed with him. So he did have these demons. Where they came from, I don't know. But what I do know and experienced is that in the big decisions on which, in my opinion, the security of America depended, he made the right decision. But from what I saw and what he honored me by letting me participate in and help and guide some of it, he was a strong president with a big flaw which destroyed him.
When you look at what happened on January 6th, it seems bigger than Watergate, or no?
Watergate was primarily, the legal aspect of Watergate was the obstruction of justice, the cover-up. The other things were not a, there were things that could have been accommodated. January 6th, the attempt to undo a recognized electoral result by a president, that was unprecedented and hopefully will never be repeated.
When you look forward and you think, let's say you're 105, 6 years from now, do you think that, is this something like the populism, the attacks on democracy? Is this a phase? Will we have gotten through it? Or are we spiraling downward?
Well, what bothers me is even, say, in the Vietnam period, when I was in Washington, and I thought life was tough, and it was. But the critics, in their majority, were believers in the system. They disagreed about the policy and were very passionate about it, and it was not easy. But now the domestic dispute seems to me more about the worthiness of the country itself. And that is a debate that makes it very hard to move from it to a compatible vision of the future.
Henry Kissinger, always a pleasure. Next, the man who runs America's newest military branch, the Space Force. General John Raymond will tell us why in space, just as on Earth, the U.S. faces many threats.